We called it Bringing a Cousin Home, how DNA revealed a non-parental event. I got a phone call from a friend about a week ago, and he goes, yeah, but I still don't understand this. Why do I want to do this? You keep telling me I want to do this. You tell me I want to put it to Jed match. I only have like third cousins. I don't see how this is going to help me. Why would I ever? Well, you have to have patience, because every day, as we all know, these databases get larger and larger. And this happened as the result of an ancestry database getting larger. So imagine my surprise. Those of you that use Ancestry to look for close matches, many of you are familiar with a page like this, and one day in mid-December, I logged on to see who my matches were and found out, okay, Mike Tools, that's my nephew, I've known about him forever. Second cousin, that's one I'm very familiar with. We actually met as the result of using Ancestry, but we've been in contact for several years. And then all of a sudden came up this new match I'd never seen before. And they identified this person as a second or third cousin. They felt extremely high confidence in labeling her this way. And I thought, well, this is just interesting, because I didn't recognize the name. Now, you're going to see throughout here that I have blanked out all the names for privacy reasons, because some of what we found out, we just don't want to put out there for everybody, especially if we're going to house this on the net. But the other thing is, good practice would say that this should be confidential, unless you have permission. So since I already did know, number one was my nephew, number two was my second cousin, I had no idea who the third one was, and so I did this. This tool rarely works for me, I got to tell you. Most of the time when I'm on Ancestry and I go to this page and I check to see who the shared matches are, it's usually you have no shared matches with this person. I don't know what your experience has been, but that's been mine. Only this time I did it, and my new cousin was related to me, of course, my nephew, of course, and then it came up this fourth cousin I'd never heard of, and it said that she had a tree. It was a very small tree of 54 people, but it was going to save me, just that little tree. In almost every case here, I've met and talked to these people. By met, I mean had conversations with them on the phone. And this is one of them, and she had used an interesting alias, so I had no idea who this person was. And it took her about 3 months maybe to actually respond to my email through Ancestry, but she eventually did. But this is what she unknowingly did for me. I pulled up her tree of 54 people, and right there you see highlighted were 3 people that I knew very well. They were in my tree. So I thought, well, this is getting more and more interesting, because obviously my new cousin is related to these 3 people. So using Ancestry.com's message service, I wrote to her, sent her a message, and basically said, there's no way I have a second cousin I don't know about. Call me. Here's my phone number. An hour later, she called me. But here was her introduction to me. She said, okay, let me make a few things clear. I do not care about genealogy at all. I do not care about DNA at all. The only reason I did this test is because she watched an Ancestry commercial. Since I was adopted, I thought it might be nice to give my kids some idea of their ethnic background. And of course I'm thinking, yeah, ethnicity, like that counts, you know, but okay. So, but as soon as she said she was adopted, I thought I was going to fall out of my chair. She had only received the results herself one day before, and this was her ethnic estimate. And as I said, she decided to take the test hoping that she could have something to share with her children. After describing my background in genealogy, and more recently my interest in DNA and its application to genealogy, she decided to share with me what she knew. I should tell you that she lives in northern Indiana, about an hour away from Chicago. Interestingly, she knew a lot. First of all, she was born in a home for unwed mothers in a suburb of Cincinnati that I'm very familiar with because I'm a Cincinnati native. She had a copy of her adoption record. She told me that many years ago, she had worked to try to figure out who her mother was. It was a 2-year project for she and a friend. We're talking 20 years ago. She finally took some clues she had, figured out who her mother was, wrote to her mother, wrote to try to get her adoption record, and they sent it to her, but of course there was no father's name provided on it. She had contacted her biological mother, who was not interested in a relationship. In fact, having an unwed child at the time was such an embarrassment that after she gave birth to this child, she moved out of state. She was born in 1947. She's 69 years old. I don't think I need to tell you what the environment was back then in 1947. She knew the neighborhood where her mother had lived because she still had about 5 copies of letters that her mother had sent to her, and she knew what neighborhood she had lived in. And she knew that she had 4 half-siblings who knew nothing about her existence. One of them has since died. He was in a car accident from the time that she started looking for these half-siblings when he was 20 years old. But she knew about them, and interestingly, because no one in her family really seemed to care about Facebook privacy settings, she had been following her mother and her 3 half-siblings that were still alive for years. She knew everything they were doing, but her mother said, "Please don't contact my children," and she respected her wish. On her biological birth certificate, as I said, her father was not listed. I now know that the mother knew who the father was, but I found out recently, I read a book about unwed mothers from that era, and many times they didn't put it on there on purpose. You know, it's like if Dad didn't step forward and say, "I'm the father," it didn't go on there. When she asked the name of her father, her mother wouldn't disclose it. She did say in one of the letters that she wrote to her that her father was in the Navy at the time of these events and did not step forward when informed of the pregnancy. He came home on a furlough. She let him know that she was pregnant. Communication stopped then. So she was placed for adoption. She wanted me to know that hers was a happy adoption, that she was raised as an only child to absolutely wonderful parents. She says her mother always joked with her that they would have adopted another child, but she had colic, and after that experience, they were done. Interestingly, I grew up in a neighborhood in Cincinnati called Pleasant Ridge. She grew up in the same neighborhood. She's 2 years older than I am. She attended my neighborhood high school, the public high school, because I was raised Catholic, she was not. She worked for a high-profile Cincinnati company after getting out of high school, followed by business school. And following her marriage, she moved to a new state, which in this case was Indiana. So I was trying to explain to this newbie who said, "I don't care." This is what you have to do. You have to transfer your results to GEDmatch so we can see what this relationship really is. And by then she was very trusting. I think we probably talked 6 or 7 hours a day those first 3 days, and I will tell you now, she's sending me stuff. She's really into genealogy. When I start getting documents from her, wait until you see what happens in the show a little bit later. But anyway, she was trusting, and she transferred her stuff to GEDmatch, so this was great because I did warn her, as we just discussed GEDmatch down in the Cincinnati group, and there are some privacy considerations, and I wanted to make sure she was aware that she wouldn't have to put her real name there, but there could be some considerations, and I went through them with her. But she was curious enough at this point to go for it. Well, this is part of a GEDmatch table. Parts of it I've blurred out, but if you can see this, the top match to her was someone named Mark. And it predicted that Mark was 1.9 generations apart from her. It actually predicted he was a first cousin. And I'm thinking, wow, oh, this is going to be so simple. Then the next one was my uncle and my aunt, who are quite elderly. And right now, I'm really glad I got their DNA because my aunt died 3 weeks after we were on this adventure here. I'd already had her DNA, but now I'm super glad because it proved, in fact, that not only was she related to me, but she was related to my aunt and uncle. The next one is me. Then someone I did not know at all, followed by my sister and my nephew. Those were her top matches. And you can see I put a red box around there. When you get the results, the things that are most important is how many total centimorgans are shared between this cousin and everybody else that we identified. And also, what's the largest centimorgan? For you people who are in a group like this, I know most of you understand centimorgans, but the key to all of this is centimorgans, not to be confused with the abbreviation centimeter, not in any way related. And this is a quote by Judy Russell. The results can be sorted by the total amount of DNA you have in common with others, measured in units called centimorgans, or cm, by the longest segment you share, and by the number of generations you're likely distant from your matches and more. So again, her closest match, they were predicting 1.9 generations to him. So using this chart that you have a copy of, you'll see in detail in a minute, I made up my own little table and I wrote down the total number of centimorgans, what the largest length was, and what the predicted relationship is. Now this is one thing, if you're not familiar with this, you really have to know. For instance, Ancestry said she was second or third cousin. Well, when you're really looking at the total centimorgans and you're referring to a chart like this, and I know the link that I gave you to that article also has another more easily understood chart in his document, you can see that they may predict first cousin, but it could be any one of these other relationships. And you have to keep that in mind. So looking at that, I thought it was interesting, for instance, the second one down, that's my uncle. They could have called him first cousin once removed, but if you also look at the other possibilities, half great aunt, uncle, niece, nephew. Next one was my aunt. My aunt sort of fit the same criteria as he did, close in total centimorgans, but didn't have any segment quite as long as what my uncle had. The next one was second cousin. That's my result. And in fact, I will tell you, I ended up being her second cousin. It had predicted second or third. In the end, I did end up being her second cousin. The next result is from the woman that we had no idea who she was, but I'm going to tell you a little bit later on why it was critical that we know about her too. And then my sister, followed by her son. I also made another table where I looked at the predicted generations because I wanted to see if the information I dug up fit in with the facts that I had. This is the green table I tried to cut out for you, but it doesn't copy very well if you're not using a color printer. But one of the nice things about this table is it gives you a range and it gives you a group. So if you're looking at first cousin in group C, it gives you the other possible relationships you would have, that you would be expected to share about 12.5% DNA. The range could be anywhere from 575 to 1,330 in the studies they've sort of done. And so at least you have a range to see if your results fit. When we were talking, you said, you know, you really ought to bring up this problem with endogamy. Good point. And if you're not familiar with endogamy, that's when somebody may come from a closed population without a lot of moving around. There's notorious ones like Jewish populations, the Ashkenazi Jews, American colonials. And the end result of that is because they intermarried within a small community over time, there's a lot of times when it's going to look like you're more related than you are. And I have a perfect example of that. Maybe some of you know Jeff Herbert, who's given me permission to use this. Jeff Herbert was the president of the Hamilton County Genealogical Society. Now he's the treasurer. And if you're from Hamilton County, everybody knows who he is because he single-handedly published like 15 books. The man, I think, sits there all night, every night, just doing indexes. But imagine my surprise. This is a 23andMe result. Imagine my surprise. My highest result was Jeff Herbert. And it said we were second to fourth cousins. And we both knew we weren't. But when we started looking at our trees, we both have families that come from this little community, Oldenburg, the Duchy of Oldenburg in northwest Germany. And when we started comparing our trees, we actually had 5 surnames in common. So there was a lot of intermarrying there within that small community. We haven't figured out our most recent common ancestor yet, but I just want to warn you that sometimes you might get a result and say, I know that isn't right. And it could be, think where they came from. That might explain it. I love GEDmatch because with GEDmatch, you can make these wonderful graphs, and I'm a visual person, and I can look at these colors. The different colors represent different lengths, but where they stack up, we actually share the same segment of DNA in common. So if we go down with these 6 people, in this particular case on chromosome 9, you can see that we have quite a bit of overlap there. The third person on this particular one has a little segment off to the right that none of the rest of us got, which I always think is curious too. Here's chromosome 12. I love this because there's a whole bunch of shared DNA sort of in the middle of the chromosome, but if you look to the right, this time the third person, who in this case is me, totally missed out on that little piece that everybody else in the group got. So there it is in black and white or blue and green or whatever. Here's one for chromosome 20. And again, you can see every person on this list is definitely related and shares a fair amount of DNA. Well, what I loved is I took all that information and plugged it into this chart, and like I knew who was my uncle, I knew who my aunt was, my sister. There were only 2 people on the list. I didn't know who they were, but they all fit exactly with what I would have predicted for this new second cousin. And being a retired elementary science teacher, I just love it when the science works out, I'll tell you. And it did perfectly. So I knew we were second cousins, but I couldn't figure out through whom. Well, my first clue was to go back to this tree where this girl had indicated that she had a Charles Joseph and Raymond Joseph, and I had these people too. And I will tell you that their surname was Moser, M-O-S-E-R. I knew all about the Mosers, but I hadn't followed them that far down in my tree. The main thing I knew is that my great-great-grandfather at the top of this list back here, Charles, had had 8 children. And I knew that only 4 of the 8 survived to adulthood, 3 boys and a girl. So, but I needed to go back and complete my tree on Ancestry for all of these descendants. I knew I had 4 that it couldn't possibly be, but I had to go back and do the other 4. Well, the 3 older ones were all boys, and I found out that it couldn't possibly be any one of the 3. Because the first thing is you'd have to be in Cincinnati in 1947 when she was conceived, and as it ended up, all 3 of these boys had moved to the Chicago area, or in one case, Illinois, but not in the Chicago area, but none were in the Cincinnati area. They had moved 100 years ago, and they all stayed in Illinois. So that left only his daughter. After all, she was a Moser too. When that came up, though, it sort of freaked me out because, boy, did I know her. She's my great-grandmother. Of course, we all know as genealogists that second cousins share great-grandparents. Wow, this is looking good. So then I had to think, well, who could Daddy be? And it looked as if my great-grandmother had a grandson who looked like the potential father. Actually, I have to tell you, I was a little relieved because before she moved things to GEDmatch, I was afraid it was my uncle, and that would not have been good. He's alive, 8 children are alive, not good. So I was almost sort of relieved that they didn't share enough DNA for that to work out. But now I've got, because he was my mother's first cousin, but certain things we had to check the box here to make sure that it sort of fit for him being a prime suspect. I'm really glad that one of the things I did was sat down and prepared this talk as we figured it out. Because now you can see the steps we went through and the qualms that we shared over this. So first of all, to be a candidate, he had to live in this area. Can you believe when we pulled up the 1940 census, the biological mom and the biological dad lived on the same street? His predicted DNA needed to fit within the parameters with all the other relationships. Also, I knew that this candidate dad had died 2 years ago. So I knew he was no longer living. He had to have served in the Navy. We knew that because in one of the letters her mother had sent, it said he was in the Navy, and when he came home on furlough, we had this whole thing. So we had to make sure he had been in the Navy in 1947. We knew that they were close in age because her mother had told her that. And of course, as I mentioned before, full seconds share a great-great-grandparent. And we both share Anna Catherine as a great-grandmother. So things are looking good. But now what? I'm going to tell you, if this ever happens to you, this is where the stress begins. Because it's really fun to work it out on paper, but now all of a sudden there's real life ramifications. My father had died 2 years ago, so there was no hope of getting a DNA test from him. I knew also that he has 3 children, and if any one of them wouldn't be willing to take a DNA test, we could positively confirm the relationship. Because she said to me, okay, now that we've done this, how can we prove it? And that's why I sent it to a few people going, check my thinking on this, because this was really worrying me, I'm telling you. But, like I said, this cousin is very tech savvy. She'd already got on Facebook, her favorite tool, and figured out that I was Facebook friends with all of these people. So it's like, what's the problem? Call them up, tell them about me. Right. So we could have a whole session just discussing these questions. These were the ones the 2 of us were discussing. Does the right of the adoptee to confirm her father supersede the rights of her half-siblings not to be contacted? You have to think about that. What impact will the disclosure have on living relatives? Should the adoptee present the evidence and ask a potential half-sibling to take a DNA test? What's the potential for harm for the biological mother who was had specifically requested that there be no contact, especially with her other 4 children, who would be her half-siblings? What is your responsibility as a family historian when it comes to identification of non-paternity events or other secrets? And I'll tell you what we did. We literally sat on the information for about 3 weeks trying to decide what to do, trying to game out every scenario. What if they react this way? I knew a little bit about these families, but as I explained to her, I said, I've not met one of these people. And she goes, what do you mean? They're Facebook friends. And I said, remember, I'm a genealogist. And when I started working on that branch of the family, and I have a blog that includes a lot of information on that branch of the family, they were very helpful to me. supplying all of their information as well as pictures of homes and other relatives that I was able to use. But they lived, this next generation, in Wichita, Georgia, and Maryland. I've not met them. So this is what we did. I have been a Facebook friend with someone who would be a first cousin, not a sibling, a first cousin to my new cousin, and I called her on the phone to discuss my suspicions, to see what her advice would be on whether or not we should approach anyone, and if so, whom. And she helped us decide which one of the 3 potential half-siblings would be best to contact. There were 2 boys and a girl. She said, call the girl first, just because of what she knew about personality and temperament. And she said, but I want to warn you, these kids worship their father. He was a really great man. He's my uncle. They worshiped him, and so I worry. Well, we were all worried. My new cousin, Pat, then sent a letter, a beautiful letter, to her potential half-sister. And after 4 days of being on pins and needles, we didn't hear a thing. Not a thing. As it ended up, the email address that she had been given by the first cousin was off by 1 letter. So it never got to the girl. But meanwhile, I'm irritated now. It's like, you're going to ignore this beautiful letter? I know it's tough, but come on. And so, unaware of this glitch, I wrote, it was either 4 or 5 page letter with all the documentation like I'm showing you. And a lot of these slides, it was included there. Look, see, let me explain what this is. You guys are half-siblings, I'm telling you. Well, I got a response from her right away saying, if she wrote to me, I'm telling you, I never got it. Oh, okay. So she asked for a couple of things. She actually is retired Navy herself. And she said, you have my dad's Navy records. Could you send them to me? I want to look them over. And also, I want Pat's date of birth. Well, once she got the date of birth, knew when her dad had enrolled in the Navy, knew when he came home on furlough, she goes, yep, that's it. So she took the initiative to contact Pat and was very, very welcoming to her, and also was willing to contact the rest of her brothers and other family members. Much to our surprise, because you never know how this is going to turn out, if you get on DNA Detectives, you can read the horror stories. This isn't always a positive thing. But in this case, every single person in the family, including aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, everybody, welcomed her to the family, called her on the phone, started sending her pictures of like her biological father. And they said when they got on her Facebook page, which I'm telling you is a good icebreaker, I said, get on her Facebook page before you call her. That'll give you an idea about her, her grandchildren's pictures, all that. Well, they took one look at her Facebook page, and they all agreed that they didn't need a DNA test. They said she was the spitting image of their grandmother. So I was really excited that they were willing to do that, talk to her on the phone, and for all of our fear, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. And among the pictures that were sent, that's her dad. And one of her new half-siblings sent that to her. In her mom's letter she had written, I thought he was handsome. I would agree. So that's her dad. So I'm thinking we're finished. Yeah, I'm not sure I see the similarity. Pat and I don't, but members of the family say, Pat on the left looks like Grandma on the right. I don't really, you think so? Well, and you know how it is when you're a family member? They all said, oh, yeah. Especially they're looking at contemporary pictures on Facebook and have the point of reference with their grandmother. They felt there were similarities there. So, I think so. Okay. So I'm thinking that's the end of the story. We're happy. I've got my PowerPoints together. I've sent it off to people to look at. Nobody's poked holes in my theory yet. The family's not ready to lynch me. I'm happy. And then, oh my God. Just when I thought we were finished, things took a turn. So originally I'd done a second PowerPoint, but I combined them all together for tonight's presentation because if you think it's been interesting so far, just wait. So let's review. In part 1, we discussed my newly discovered second cousin, Pat, who, by the way, has reviewed this and is perfectly fine with me using her first name. We outlined the procedures used to identify her biological father. Within 6 weeks of this discovery, Pat had 3 new half-siblings, an aunt and uncle, several nieces and nephews, and numerous new cousins. And happily, everyone was very welcoming. For 20 years, though, Pat had known who her biological mother was. She had a copy of the adoption record. She knew she had 4 half-siblings. Her biological mother, after writing several letters and sending family pictures, decided to cut off contact and specifically requested that Pat had honored that all these times, even though she knew who they were. But then this happened. At the time, since she was a newbie genealogist, she had made me editor on her Facebook page, and I'm adding members to her tree, and all of a sudden I see she's got a new DNA match. And it says it's Sarah. And that Sarah's a first cousin. And that they share 674 centimorgans across 30 DNA segments. And I call her up and I'm like freaking out. And she doesn't understand why I was freaking out, but I realized that Sarah was the daughter of one of her half-sisters. Now what? We're back to stewing. What are we going to do now? Because we know what Mom had said. And I said to her, you know what? This is a whole different situation. They're doing DNA tests now. That's not on you. That's on them. You come up as a match. They say first or second cousin. In fact, she's a half-aunt. But again, remember the table. I said, I think that's a different deal. So we probably stewed over that for 2 or 3 days. And then I, being the impatient one, said, and by the way, there's the other possible relationships. I Googled her. And I found out where she worked, that she's 30 years old, a social worker. And I called her up. Because I thought, she's surely, since she bothered to get this DNA test, is going to wonder about this first cousin that she knows she doesn't have. So I call her up, I get her at work. Luckily, she hadn't come in for that day yet, and they said, we'll ever call you back. She does. Very, very nice. I lay this on her. And interestingly, she said that she wasn't totally surprised because one time Grandpa at a family function said something about, you all have a half-sister out there somewhere that was adopted. Right. So she wasn't totally surprised, but she said, my mom, who would have been one of the half-siblings, they had no idea how to go about this. This was several years ago. They weren't going to corner Mom on it because Mom is very sensitive, and they weren't going to confront Mom, but she said, it really doesn't shock me. And then she said to me, uncle? And I said, no, why would I contact your uncle? I knew who he was, but it's like, why would I contact him? And she said, well, he's really into genealogy. And she goes, and I think he's taken a DNA test. It's like, whoa. Well, he had used MyHeritage, the one place I had not tested. Tree, DNA, the whole shebang. Okay? And he knew nothing about GEDmatch. So she even took it upon herself. She says, I don't know how to approach this. I don't know. She's talking about the next generation. Grandma's going to flip, you know, blah, blah, blah. I said, let me give you some advice like we did. Just rest on it for a couple days. You'll know what to do. 2 days later, she had contacted him, and daggone if we don't get an email from him with both of our names on it, and he wanted to have a conference call. So that particular Friday afternoon, you know, we're talking on the phone. He's for the first time finding out he's got this half-sister he had no idea about. He didn't even mention Grandpa popping off at a family function, so I don't know if he was there when that happened. And then, of course, he's stewing like, oh my gosh, how do I bring this up with Mom? Everybody keeps telling us Mom is a sensitive being who's 88 years old. And now we're going to dump this on Mom, right? So he's trying to decide what to do about that. He wanted to make sure before he did anything that there was DNA to prove their relationship. So, like I said, he'd already tested on MyHeritage and he had taken a DNA test. So once again, I do my favorite thing. While we're talking to him on the phone and say, look, you've got to upload your DNA to GEDmatch. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this. You can do a one-to-one compare usually within an hour. You can't use all the tools until it gets processed, which is usually a day or two. But while we're talking on the phone, you know, it's cooking. So we're feeling good about this. I'm going to call him A. We asked him to transfer stuff to GEDmatch. He was completely open to this suggestion, even though I explained again how the privacy issues. We used the one-to-one comparison tool. We put in her kit number, his kit number, asked for the graphics and positions, and well, look at this. If you're not familiar with GEDmatch, at the bottom of their analysis, they always tell you what the largest segment was between the two kits, the total number of segments that were more than 7 centimorgans. They had 41 matching segments, and it estimated their number of generations to be 1.5. And of course, they're half siblings. So it's like, oh, this is beautiful. This is, once again, you know, when the science works, I love it. So then he said, about an hour into the conversation, he said, well, I'm new to this whole DNA thing. Again, he's an expert, let me tell you. Now he's an expert. But he said, tell me how you figured this out. Like, what was your process? So I go through the same things I just explained to you. And then I said to him, well, the thing that confuses us is there's this Mark who comes up as her first cousin. And we were amazed because we probably spent 2 months trying to figure out everything we could about Mark, because immediately we wrote to Mark and I said, would you be willing to help my cousin? He writes back immediately, oh, yes, yes. Get in touch with him and he goes, oh, I was hoping you were going to help me because I'm adopted. Mark, I know nothing about my parents. I was born in Texas. I got my adoption record with the parents' names totally redacted. I know I was born in Austin, Texas in 1971. That's it. A social worker actually contacted my biological mother and she said, I do not want to have contact. So he knew nothing. Well, boy, this is getting interesting now. So then we go on down. The other person I didn't know was this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 person on the list. Her name is Helma. Helma's quite elderly. I start trying, you have to go back and do your ancestry trees, and I'm trying to figure out, luckily she had an uncommon name. Not like me, Kathy Jones, when I grew up, you know, but she had an uncommon name. So I could find information on her in trees on Ancestry. So now I know for sure that since Mark matches her and Pat matches her, and so does her brother match her, I know that it's on her maternal side of the family. Okay, so this is getting more and more interesting. So I explained this to the guy. Here's the table that you saw in the first thing. After I explained all of this to A, and went back and constructed a mirror tree with everything I could and found out about Helma being on the maternal side, I then say to him, well, see, she had this first cousin, but we cannot figure out who this first cousin is. But it could be other relationships. That's why I put wait for it. Because his response, thinking he was being flippant funny, was, oh, he was born in Texas? Well, shoot, I was living in Texas in 1971. So was my brother, the one killed in the car accident. My brother or I could be the father of that kid, I guess. I mean, I made my parents crazy in college. I was just a long-haired hippie. I made them nuts. Well, now, things are still cooking over there at Judd Match. Anybody notice anything? Okay, you see the blue bar?
Yes.
Guess who the daddy was? He was. And my new cousin, who did not care about DNA or genealogy, is calling up new brother going, you're the daddy. Look at this. Okay, so now it's like, oh my gosh. You can imagine poor A, right? He's been on the phone for an hour. He just met a half-sister he didn't know he had. Even though he's done genealogy, he'd never heard of Judd Match and hadn't done this before. And now it's like, you're the daddy. And he goes, oh man, I really have a problem now. First of all, I got to tell my wife. I have children. He's my age. He's exactly 67. Well, now I'm 68 years old. And he goes, and I got to talk to my mom. Oh, man. And once again, I said, sit on it for a couple days. You'll figure out what to do. This is A, is the father of Mark.
Her half-brother.
Yes, her half-brother is the father of what was listed as her first cousin. In fact, it's a half-nephew, which again, according to the chart, could be. So that's like, wow.
She's the half-aunt to these people.
Right, to this Mark and his children. Okay, so he's really got a lot on his plate, you can imagine.
He doesn't know anything about these others.
He has no idea. In fact, we laughed like crazy when he said to us, well, could you tell from that who his mother was? And we just started laughing going, we thought you could tell us who his mother was. And he goes, honestly, I have no idea. But after 3 sleepless nights, he figured it out. He said, I remember this girl. We were really, really good friends. He said, never mind, I was dating someone else. But we were really good friends. And I knew that her father worked for my father. So I called my father. Oh, by the way, Dad, you got a new grandson. Oh, and by the way, you know, who was that guy that worked for you? What was his last name? He tells him, oh, okay, I think I got his daughter pregnant. And, you know. So then he remembers, he goes, you two are really going to think I am stupid. We said, why is that? And he goes, well, shortly after that, we were living in one part of Texas, moved to another city. And she came up with a girlfriend to visit. Called me up on the phone and say, hey, I'm over at such and such park. Why don't you come over and meet me? And she was there with another girlfriend, you know, because they had been really good friends, but moved to a new city. So he says, I go over to the park. He even had a picture of it. And she was very pregnant. And he said, now I know you're going to think I'm stupid, but I'm thinking, who got her pregnant? And he said, if you knew what her job was right now, it's no wonder that she didn't want to have contact. But meanwhile, this guy, since he's a genealogist and loves family history, called him that afternoon. I have to hand it to him and said, here's the deal, you know. And they don't live in the same city. In fact, they're, you know how big Texas is. They're about 700 miles apart in Texas, but I'm sure they'll get it together. And of course, then he's saying to us, and now I got to tell my mother, I've got, you know, my wife, I've got these kids, I got to tell my 2 sisters, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. But I have to hand it to him because within 90 minutes, he was talking to the half-sister he knew nothing about, now discovered he had a son. His son was a half-nephew to my cousin Pat, not a first cousin as ancestry had sort of predicted, but everything was fitting together perfectly, and you could see that line all the way across. I mean, there's no doubt about that. When the brother, it was him, you know, that was the father. So then he calls us a few days later, he goes, Okay, I had the conversation with my mother. And he goes, I said to her, Mom, I want you to understand, I took a DNA test. Your granddaughter took a DNA test. We both ended up being related to someone who's your daughter, you know, that you didn't tell us about. And of course, she's all like very concerned for him. Oh, you know, does it bother you? How are you taking this? On and on, all concerned about his feelings. To which he said, oh, I don't feel nearly as bad as finding out I have a son that I didn't know about. Congratulations, Mom, you got a new grandson, too. So, things have moved on now. I'm not expecting a new chapter. A wrote to his newly identified son. A contacted his mother, who friended, I'm talking about his own mother, who is now Facebook friends with her biological daughter she did not want to be in contact with. And I kept saying to that family, it is really a shame that they don't know each other, because if you would see her Facebook page, they could complete each other's sentences. They think the same way about everything, you know. And I said they could get along so great if she could just get over the stigma that I know was incredible in 1947. Pat's sister and niece have also friended Pat on Facebook. So now she's, you know, the poor girl was raised an only child. You can imagine her world is different now. A's son has become Facebook friends with his newly identified biological family. And I feel like I've helped a couple of families connect, and I'm optimistic about their future relationships. So, don't ever let anyone convince you that DNA is not an essential tool in genealogy. You just don't know when it's going to pop up. Finally, make sure, and I think this is really important, that those who submit their DNA consider the possible outcomes. You read all the time about people that did this and had no idea what was going to turn up. And I think you need to, when you're trying to convince somebody to take a DNA test for you, I think you need to make sure they're aware that this could happen. In this scenario, only M out of these people had taken a DNA test in the hope of uncovering family. Mark was the only one that was hoping to find family. And thankfully he did. So, any questions? I bet you do. And